Welcome back to Build a Mobile App in 2 Hours. In this session, we're going to work on building the new SpaceTrip data and the SpaceTrip screen. So, to set up the new SpaceTrip data and screen, we're going to have to create a SpaceTrip entity. So inside the data area, we can create entities that are in the database, and we can create entities that are stored locally on the device. So in our entity, we're going to create some simple trip info like the name, the departure date, and the return date. And we'll have a local copy so the app will be able to work even if we're not online. We'll then begin working on the screen. And to define the screen, we'll set up a form that can take the name and then some calendars with a button to go to the next screen. This will take a little bit of work. So we're going to work on setting up the entity and the basic part of the screen in this session. Let's go ahead and get started. To create our new SpaceTrip screen, we'll come over to the UI flows, and we have to think about where we'd like to place the screen. So it's not really a common thing, and it's not part of our main flow because it's kind of setting up a new trip wizard. It's not onboarding, and it's not the pin code, so let's go ahead and create a new UI flow. If we right-click on the folder, we can add a UI flow, and we'll call this the new SpaceTrip wizard. And if I hit enter, we now have a new UI flow that has a default screen, which is being referred to as screen 1. If we select screen 1, we can change the name of screen 1 to be our new SpaceTrip screen. And by default, it's set up not to be accessed anonymously, so you have to be a registered user to get to it. So that sounds good. If we go to the new SpaceTrip screen and double click, it opens the editor where we just get the default background color as something to start with. Now, we want this to be able to accept the name and the dates, so I'm going to go to the toolbox and grab a form to help us collect data, and I'm going to drop it in the content area of the screen. Now, it highlights it as yellow to begin with because our form needs to know what type of data that it should try to collect. And we can see here in the hint that it suggests we go to the data area and we use some sort of data to define what's going to be collected in the form. So let's go to the Data tab. And here in the Data tab, we see that we can define entities, which are going to be persistently stored, or we could define structures, and these are things that are being kept in memory. There are also site properties and resources as other types of data that we can store. So let's start by creating our new SpaceTrip as something that can be stored in the database. So we'll name it SpaceTrip. And when we create it, you can see that there's a little red line underneath the SpaceTrip. And that's because if we don't add any attributes, then the SpaceTrip isn't really going to be doing anything. Entities don't mean anything if they're not storing any new data. Because by default, all it has is an ID, and this ID is just creating a unique number that's a long integer, and it's just automatically creating the numbers through the database. So we have an ID, and if you notice, for the SpaceTrip, we also have what we call actions, and these are entity actions, and these are our CRUD actions. So we can create a SpaceTrip, we can update a SpaceTrip, retrieve it, and delete it. So all of the actions to interact with this entity have already been created for us. So I'm going to right-click on the SpaceTrip entity and add a new attribute. And I'll say name. And by adding a name in the properties area, we see that it's text and the length is 100. We may have some people who would like more creative names, so let's give them 100 characters to do that. And we're going to make this mandatory so that they have to add a name so that we have some way of identifying which trip they're talking about from a human perspective. And if we right click on the SpaceTrip again and add another entity attribute, I can add departure date. And if I use camel case and make date at the back end capitalized, we'll see that in the properties, it immediately sees that the data type, or it tries to assume that the data type is going to be a date. So let's make this mandatory as well, because we need to know when they'll leave. And let's also add an entity attribute for the return date. And same thing happens where we get the date data type, which is great, and we'll say that it's mandatory. So now we have our SpaceTrip with all of its entity actions. So that's set up pretty well. But we mentioned that we'd like our app to be able to define trips even if we're not online. So if they can see the planets because they've been loaded onto the phone, they should also be able to create a SpaceTrip while they're there. So if we go to local storage, we can right click and say add entity from database. And in this case, it gives us the list of all the entities. And there are a bunch of these blue with red line entities. These are static entities. And here's our SpaceTrip in all blue because it's a database entity that we just created. By selecting it, it now says, okay, we're going to use SpaceTrip. Which of the attributes would you like to add? And we're going to select them all because we didn't give the SpaceTrip any extra attributes, and it didn't already exist with lots. So it does give us a warning saying that we should avoid mirroring the server data model. So we shouldn't take everything that's in the database and move it to the device just because we want to. In this case, it's such a little set of data, and it's the required data that we can click add and not have any problems. So now I have the local SpaceTrip available, and if I open it, it is sharing the same ID as the entity from the database. So you can see it is referencing the one from the database entity. And if we look at that, you can actually see the SpaceTrip identifier isn't a local SpaceTrip identifier, it's the one from above. And we have the name, departure date, and return date, which is great. So now that we have all of our data set up, let's go back to the user interface tab, and in our new SpaceTrip screen, let's give it the title, and we'll call it New Trip. And again, it wants us to drag and drop some data here. So our SpaceTrip screen needs some way of capturing the input that will be in that form. So let's add a local variable, and let's call it local SpaceTrip. And if we give it local SpaceTrip, then it assumes the data type should be local SpaceTrip. Now, this doesn't mean it's actually being stored in the device. This local variable is in memory. And if we open it, we see that it has the exact same structure as that local SpaceTrip entity that we were using. And in this case, because the form would like us to drag and drop some information to begin setting up the form, let's go ahead and grab the name and drag and drop it to the form. So now the form has begun creating some data entry that's possible. So it created a name, and it has a label there. It has a field for the input, and it has a save button for us to be able to save off this data. So we've been able to get the basic structure of the screen going, and we've been able to set up our data. So we're going to go ahead and stop here, and then we'll come back in the next section to add all the rest of the logic and behavior to this screen. So join me in the next section where we'll finish our new SpaceTrip screen.